I was never certain that I was ever actually going to make a video like this. I watch a lot of YouTube videos with social commentary, and most of the YouTubers that I subscribe to have a politically incorrect point of view. But I never thought I was going to take part in the conversation, not on YouTube anyway, because I didn't know what I was going to say that hasn't been said 100 times before, and by people who undoubtedly will have more skill at making these videos than I do. The only way I was ever going to make a video like this is if I had something to add to the conversation that I hadn't heard, or at least had not heard very often. And there's a particular opinion that I voice just in personal conversations with people that I don't hear very often at all. So I decided to make this video about it. Now, which conversation in particular am I talking about? Well, I will introduce the conversation in a way that will probably prompt a lot of people to just stop watching the video instantly. But I do not support Black Lives Matter. Now, when I say that, people will want to know why. And quite often the question will be, well, don't you believe that Black Lives Matter? And I really don't mind that question, even when it's got that kind of tone to it. Because the question is a valid one. And besides that, I get to give the answer, yes, I do believe that Black Lives Matter. I believe that absolutely. I believe that all Black Lives Matter. I embrace that concept so completely that if someone were to tell me they don't believe Black Lives Matter, I'd probably wonder why I'm talking to them. But like I said, it's not the question I mind. And it's not the concept that I mind. Because the sentence, Black Lives Matter, is a perfectly acceptable, truthful, elegant, in its simplicity, statement. It is the organization, not the idea, that I take issue with. That's true for a lot of people. And this video isn't actually about my stance against the Black Lives Matter movement. That's just kind of where the concept begins. And I suppose it's only fair for me to give you some reasons why I don't support this group and its supporters. I take issue with both the ends that they pursue and the means that they use to achieve those ends. The means that we're talking about, I cannot support an organization who storms events that are not their own, takes the microphone out of someone else's hand, and hijacks it to their own purpose. You cannot demand your own freedoms while stepping on someone else's freedoms. It doesn't work that way. I cannot support an organization who has so many members and supporters who cry for violence, particularly against the police. I cannot support a group that celebrates when police are killed. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's not all of them. And they're right, it's not. But is it enough of them? Because this fanatical element, this violent element, it's not some tiny little sliver of a lunatic fringe. It's a huge part of their group. Whether they want it to be or not, it's there and it's big. And I will have nothing to do with it. I can't support a group whose response to terror attacks in France is to start the hashtag #FuckParis. That's unconscionable. That's reprehensible. I'll have nothing to do with it. But a lot of people who are like me will respond to the phrase Black Lives Matter with all lives matter. I don't believe in Black Lives Matter because I believe that all lives matter. And that's very poetic. It also happens to make sense, but it's really not a very good counterpoint. And that's what this video will be about, is something I want to say instead of that. Specifically about police violence. Disregarding everything else, specifically when it comes to the idea that somehow it is dangerous to be black in America, that they're being targeted by the police. I don't believe that. But the phrase "all lives matter" has very little to do with that, or any of the rest of the Black Lives Matter ideology. Now, I'll stop here for a moment to point out that a lot of people, when they hear "all lives matter," will say, well, when black people say Black Lives Matter, white people get uncomfortable and have to say all lives matter. Well, no, on both counts. I know a whole hell of a lot of people who believe in Black Lives Matter who are not black. Some of them are whiter than I am, and that takes some doing. And there are plenty of black people who do not support Black Lives Matter. Some of the YouTubers I mentioned, I watch a lot of them who are black who agree with me that Black Lives Matter is not something that can or should be supported. So it's not black people say it and white people don't want to hear it, and it's not just white people saying all lives matter. All the same, that doesn't make the all lives matter statement particularly useful. It's not unintelligent, but it's just not useful. Because if you tell someone that you think that all lives matter, now a lot of Black Lives Matter supporters will actually get upset that anyone has the temerity to question their cause with a counterphrase like that. And that kind of annoys me because even though I don't use the phrase all lives matter, it's not one of my arguments, the question that's inherent in it is every bit as important as when people ask me why I don't support Black Lives Matter. Do you support, or don't you think that all lives matter, is the question that is asked by that. And a lot of people who believe in Black Lives Matter and supporters, they can say yes, and they can mean it. And I know that. I know it's not just a group of lunatics. But the group Black Lives Matter as a whole, it's what I read about it, the things that they've accomplished, the things that they ignore particularly, and the things that they do instead of the things they ignore, it leads me to believe that all lives do not matter to Black Lives Matter. I don't even think that all black lives matter to Black Lives Matter. I almost have to go over that in my head. You talk about this too long and it starts sounding like tongue twisters. But if I got that sentence out right, that still doesn't change the fact that all lives matter doesn't work as a counterpoint. It does explain your stance, I suppose, but if you say to someone, don't you think all lives should matter? Then they can say, yes, all lives do matter, and then move on and not address any of your other concerns. Some people who are supporters of Black Lives Matter will take it further than that and will converse about it, and that I appreciate. A lot of the time I will find their arguments uninspiring, sometimes even unintelligent. Other times it does make sense, but that doesn't make them right. There is, for example, fancy little logic experiments, that I've heard the word syllogism used. And the syllogism that I've heard more than once is, well, if you say save the rainforest, that doesn't mean that you don't value other trees. And that's very clever and that's very witty, but the metaphor fails pretty quickly. I mean, that just collapses. Because if you say save the rainforest, no one in your group is demanding the deaths of park rangers to protect the other trees. And no one's celebrating if those park rangers happen to be killed. And no one in your group is charging into events organized by other environmental groups and taking the microphone and demanding that you talk only about their issues. So the save the rainforest metaphor is a worse answer to all lives matter than all lives was to Black Lives Matter. But like I said, the reason I'm making this video is to supply something other than all lives matter as a simple little phrase. And the phrase that I have in mind, what would work, I think, as a hashtag is headlines are not reality. And what that means, when I ask people why they support Black Lives Matter, now let me scratch that. Like I said, I'm talking specifically about police violence. Why is it people believe that the police are so dangerous to black people, that black people are being killed specifically by racist white cops? Some people will have a real answer. And as much as I may disagree with most of those answers, if not all of them, a real answer is a real answer. But by and large, what I hear from people is, well, you hear about it all the time. It's always in the news. I can't, it's just happens so frequently. But do you really hear about it all the time? Who do you hear about it from? The guy down the street who saw it? No. You hear about it from the media, from the press. And the press is not to be trusted. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows you're not supposed to believe what you read or what you hear. You're especially not supposed to believe what you hear in the news. And everyone knows that, and most people can apply that at least to an individual news story. But a whole lot of people seem to have that capacity for skepticism fail when they hear 2 or 3 stories in a row that all sound similar. Well, it must be everywhere all the time. There must be an epidemic. And it creates the illusion that this is happening everywhere when that's not necessarily so. You have to be able to provide more than just headlines to say why you believe something, because headlines are not reality. What if unarmed white people are also killed by the police? Oh, they are. Now, you've probably heard that too, and you can make a counter-argument to that, but it doesn't change the fact that the headlines alone cannot explain why it is a person should believe this, or why they should get so upset. Because headlines are not reality. However much you may like a particular headline, it's still not reality. Headlines are clickbait. All headlines are clickbait. They were clickbait before the internet was invented. Back when people bought a lot of newspapers, if you see 3 newspapers lying on the stand there, and the story's about an orphanage fire, if one newspaper has the headline, "Firefighters Fight Orphanage Blaze," people will probably buy a lot of copies of that paper. But if the newspaper next to it says, "4 tragic deaths in orphanage fire," more people are going to buy that paper, because it has the more attractive headline. And that's what I mean by that. Newspapers, the news media, has always used headlines to attract your attention. The more dramatic, the bigger the headline, the better. And that is even more true now in the internet age than it was before. But that doesn't make those headlines the reality. That means that they wanted you to read their story, so they have to give a particular kind of headline. And if a particular news story gets them a lot of business and a lot of attention, they will tell a similar story as soon as they can. And they will disregard other stories that would take away from that narrative. A lot of people think that the media has a bias towards certain stories, especially on this issue, and I tend to agree with that. But the bias doesn't have to be there for the fact to be true that the headlines are designed to get your attention, not necessarily to tell the truth. Our media is supposed to be responsible. They're supposed to be objective. They're supposed to keep us informed. But we have freedom of press, and that's a very dangerous thing. Now, you take that sentence, freedom of press is a dangerous thing. That sounds disgusting. Freedom of press is essential. I would not want to live in any nation without freedom of press. But most freedoms come at some cost, and freedom of press comes at a higher cost than most. The trouble with having freedom of press is that you then have a free press. They are answerable to no one. They are responsible only to themselves. And that means they don't have to tell you the truth. They can tell you whatever they want. They can do whatever gets them the most money, the most attention, the most clicks. And then they create more and more clickbait headlines without necessarily keeping us informed of what is true and real. Because headlines are not reality. And it's not just the common, average, everyday person who just believes the headlines. There's a famous viral video out now called, I'm probably going to get the title wrong because it's a mouthful, but it's 23 Ways to be Killed If You're Black in America. I think that's the title. They were pretty sharp, though. They knew that that's a mouthful, so their hashtag just cuts that down to 23 ways. But in the video, you've got Alicia Keys, I think, put this together, and she got a lot of other celebrities together to take part in this. And I've got to digress here for a moment. It always annoys the hell out of me when that happens. It doesn't matter if it's something I can get behind completely, like support for flood survivors. When I see a bunch of rich, world-famous celebrities get together and get the accolades and the good press for being part of this, it doesn't ring true to me at all. If Alicia Keys wants to make this video and it's just her voice doing it, I would have more respect for it. If instead of that they had people you wouldn't recognize who seem like they're just common people on the street doing this video, I would have a hell of a lot more respect for it. I still wouldn't agree with it, though, because what takes place in this video, all they do is they will describe a way you can be killed if you're black in America, and then they will show a famous face and a famous name that are, in turn, a famous headline that you recognize. But headlines are not reality. So I'm not impressed even when you can string several of them together. As you know, if you say that you can be killed in America if you're black for driving with a broken taillight, or walking away from your pickup, or selling cigarettes on a street corner. If I had the time and the inclination, I could put together a similar video titled 23 Ways to be Killed If You're White in America, and I would have phrases, you can be killed if you're white in America for wearing headphones, for going camping, for getting out of your pickup, for riding a bicycle. If I were to make a video like that, the point would not be, well, white people get killed too. I would preface that by explaining that if I can string together a bunch of news stories, a bunch of headlines, even if they're not quite as recognizable, and that would try to illustrate that white people are in great danger of being killed by the police, even if they're innocent, unarmed citizens, that wouldn't make that so. The same is true if you run headlines that describe black people being killed by the police. Stringing together a bunch of headlines and a bunch of famous stories does not make your point. You have to have more than just the headlines. That's why the phrase, headlines are not reality, can be so useful. Because if you say, well, all lives matter, they can say, of course they do, and then they don't have to answer anything else that you say. But the phrase, headlines are not reality, demands that they offer more substance to their argument than just, I heard this story and this story and this story, so I believe it happens everywhere. And some people can do that. And like I said, I still disagree with it, but that's not what this video is about, so I'm not going to take the time for that. I am going to refer back to one of the stories that I mentioned from the 23 Ways to Die If You're Black video, and that's, selling cigarettes on the street corner. That's the Eric Garner story. Saw that video, heard that story, couldn't believe it happened. That's not true. I could believe it happened, but I was still shocked and disgusted by it. I kind of doubt that the motive behind that was racist, but that's kind of the point here of my calling back to it. White officer killed an unarmed black man on the sidewalks. And suppose it were possible to somehow know what the officer's motive was. Not guess it, but somehow know it. We can't. But if it were possible to tell absolutely that racism was not even a little part of his motive for what he did, would that make Garner's death any less tragic? No. Would it make the protests around his death any less meaningful? No, it would not. I am less concerned with the potential for a racist motive than I am for the actual death and the abuse of police force that brought it about. So are other people. And that's why when I mentioned white people being killed by cops, in what would admittedly be a very ridiculous video without the preface I said I would give it, riding a bicycle. That is a reference to the William Bowers case. I'll have a link in the description to a news article I read. And a lot of people, well, wait a second, you're telling us not to believe what we read in the news. That's true. But I don't want you to read this article or pay attention or know this story because I'm trying to make the point that white people also get killed too. This article doesn't prove that. I'm not trying to disprove the idea that it's dangerous for black people with this article because it doesn't prove that. But there was a particular part of it that interested me that I don't hear nearly enough of, that I wish I saw more of. William Bowers was an unarmed white citizen shot and killed by the police. And according to this article, and I've only read the one article, so if facts emerge that prove this story false, I do apologize. But according to witnesses, according to this article, there was little or perhaps no provocation, no reason for this to have happened, and yet it did. A man is dead for no real reason. And the response to that is what really fascinated me, because civil rights groups in the area rose up and protested against that. And they went to the district attorney's office and demanded that charges be filed, or that it's at least looked into. And as the article states it, the majority of these of these civil rights groups are African American. That's their words. Why would they do that? Why would they protest the killing of an unarmed white citizen? I mean, isn't it supposed to matter more if they're black? But to these people, it didn't matter enough to prevent them from taking part because they saw an injustice and did something about it. Now, I don't doubt that they would have paid more attention if it had been someone black, and I can't entirely fault them for that because their worldview probably doesn't line up with mine. But they don't focus exclusively on that. And I have such a great deal of respect for that, I had to mention it and get people, make people aware of it. And I don't think that these civil rights activists who are taking part in that struggle are doing that because they think that all lives matter. That may be part of it. But mainly they're doing it because they don't care that that wasn't a big enough headline. Because like me, they know. And like I want everyone else to realize and understand, headlines are not reality. If you have use for that, use it as a phrase, as a statement, as a hashtag. Spread that around the internet. Headlines are not reality. We cannot trust the press even when they're on our side. You must have a better argument than that. I'll say it one last time before the video ends. Headlines are not reality.